the night I learned my parents had sold my childhood home. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a mug my mother had given me when I was 16. I thought the worst thing I would feel was sadness. I was wrong. The worst part was realizing they had never planned to tell me at all. I found out because a neighbor called me. She sounded nervous. She asked if I had heard about the house on Maple Street. I laughed because I thought she was talking about some repair. Then she said, "Your parents sold it last week." My stomach dropped. That house wasn't just a building to me. It was where my bedroom still had pencil marks on the closet door. It was where my father taught me to ride a bike. It was where my mother held me after my first heartbreak and promised me I would always have a place to come home to. I called my mother immediately. She answered like nothing was wrong. "Mom, did you sell the house?" There was a long silence, then she sighed. "Yes. Your father and I decided it was time." I couldn't believe how calmly she said it. "What about me?" She actually laughed. "Sweetheart, you're 32. You don't own that house." I felt something inside me crack. I reminded her that years ago, Dad had promised that one day the house would be mine. She dismissed it as something he said when I was a child. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Don't start acting entitled. Your brother never asks us for anything." That sentence hurt more than the sale. I hung up before she could hear me crying. If you've ever had someone make you feel like you don't matter to your own family, stay with me. And if stories about truth, betrayal, and finding your strength mean something to you, subscribe to Calm Revenge Stories. Because what happened next changed everything I believed about my parents. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at an old photograph of our family standing in front of that house. I wondered how many memories could disappear with a signature. Then, just after midnight, someone knocked on my door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a gray-haired man stood beneath the hallway light. He looked at me for several seconds, then he held out a small wooden box. "Your father left this for you," he said. My heart stopped. Because my father had been dead for 11 months. I stared at the box in his hands, unable to move. "Who are you?" The man swallowed hard. "Someone your father trusted." Then he looked over his shoulder as if he was afraid someone had followed him. "Your parents were never supposed to sell that house." I couldn't breathe. I took the box from him with shaking hands. It was heavier than it looked, and carved into the lid were 3 words. "For my daughter." I hadn't heard my father's voice in almost a year, but somehow at that moment, I felt like he was standing beside me. I locked the door after the stranger left and carried the box to my kitchen table. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely fit the key into the tiny brass lock. Inside was a folded letter, an old photograph, and a sealed envelope with my name written across it in my father's handwriting. I touched the ink with my fingertip. For a moment, I couldn't open it. Part of me was terrified. Another part of me desperately wanted to believe Dad had left me something more valuable than money. He had left me an answer. I unfolded the letter first. My eyes immediately filled with tears. "My daughter, if you're reading this, then something happened that I prayed you would never have to face." I stopped. My breathing became shallow. Then I read the next line. "Your mother knows about this. Your brother does too." I stared at the words. My brother? What could my father possibly have been hiding from me? I kept reading. "The house was never meant to belong to them." My hands went numb. The house, my childhood home. The house my parents had just sold. I looked at the sealed envelope. There was one final sentence beneath the letter. "Do not trust anyone who tells you the sale was legal." I sat there for nearly an hour, crying and rereading those words. My whole life had suddenly become a question. Why had Dad written this? Why had my mother laughed when I asked for my share? And why had a stranger delivered this to me the very night I discovered the house was gone? I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single document. At the top was the name of a law firm I recognized. Underneath it was a date from 27 years earlier. The day I was born. I stared at the page until the words blurred. Then I saw my father's signature. And below it was a sentence that made my entire body go cold. "This property shall remain in trust for my daughter until her 30th birthday." I whispered, "What?" I read it again. And again. My parents hadn't simply sold my childhood home. They may have sold something that legally belonged to me. I didn't sleep that night. By sunrise, I had made one decision. I was going to find out exactly what my parents had done. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them scare me into staying quiet. The next morning, I drove to the law firm listed on the document. I expected an empty office or some retired attorney who wouldn't remember anything from 27 years ago. Instead, the receptionist looked at the document and immediately picked up the phone. "Mr. Harris," she said quietly. "She's here." My heart began pounding. A few minutes later, an elderly attorney walked into the room. The moment he saw me, his expression changed. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. "You finally came," he said. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He closed the office door. Then he told me something that made my entire understanding of my family collapse. "Your father came here 3 weeks before he died." I felt my eyes burn. "Why?" The attorney looked directly at me. "Because he knew your parents were planning to take your house." I couldn't speak. He opened a file that had been locked away for almost a year. Inside were copies of bank statements, property records, and photographs. Then he placed one final document on the desk. "This is the original trust agreement." I picked it up. My name was printed across the top, but there was something else. A handwritten note from my father was attached to the back. I unfolded it slowly. "If they have sold the house, don't fight them for the money." I frowned. That wasn't what I expected. Then I read the next line. "Fight them for the truth." My chest tightened. The attorney watched me carefully. "Your father didn't leave you the house because he wanted you to live there forever," he said. "He left it because he knew what your parents had been doing behind your back." "What were they doing?" He pushed another file toward me. "Your brother's debts." I stared at him. My brother had always been treated like the golden child. My parents constantly defended him, paid his bills, and rescued him from every mistake. But I never imagined they had been using our family home to cover his debts. The attorney explained that over the years, money had been borrowed against the property without my knowledge. My father had discovered it. He had tried to stop it. And that was when the family started falling apart. I suddenly remembered the last Christmas before Dad died. He had pulled me aside and told me, "If anything happens to me, don't let them convince you that you're selfish." At the time, I thought he was talking about some silly family argument. Now, I understood. He had been warning me. The attorney pointed to the newest document. "This is the sale agreement." I looked at the buyer's name. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a stranger, it was my mother's brother, my uncle. The house hadn't really been sold to an outsider. My parents had transferred it within the family for a fraction of its value, and the money had disappeared almost immediately. I felt angry, then betrayed, then strangely calm, because suddenly everything made sense. My mother's laughter, my brother's silence, the rushed sale, the secret meeting. They thought I would be too emotional to investigate. They thought grief had made me weak. They were wrong. I left the law office carrying copies of every document. Before I reached my car, my phone rang. It was my mother. I answered. She didn't say hello. She said, "Where did you get those papers?" I froze. "You know exactly what papers I'm talking about." Her voice changed. "You need to stop digging." For the first time, I heard fear in her voice. Not anger, not guilt, fear. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Your father didn't tell you everything." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What didn't he tell me?" She was silent, then she whispered, "Ask him who really owned that house before he died." The call ended. I stood beside my car, staring at the screen. My father's trust agreement said the house was meant for me. My parents had secretly transferred it. My uncle had bought it. And now my mother was telling me there was another owner. I thought I had finally uncovered the truth. I hadn't. I had only found the first layer. That night, I returned home and opened the wooden box again. I picked up the old photograph I'd ignored earlier. It showed my father standing in front of our house, but someone had written something on the back, a date, and beneath it, 6 words, "Ask her why she brought you home." I stared at the sentence for a long time, then I realized something terrifying. The date on the photograph was 6 months before I was born. And the woman standing beside my father wasn't my mother. She was someone I'd never seen before. I turned the photograph over again. My hands were shaking. Because suddenly, the question wasn't just who owned my childhood home. It was whether the life I'd grown up believing was mine had ever been the truth at all. The next morning, I went back to the law firm. I placed the photograph on the attorney's desk. He looked at it. Then he closed his eyes. "You found her," he whispered. "Who is she?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another drawer and pulled out a file with my name on it. Not my married name. My birth name. The one I hadn't used since childhood. He placed it in front of me. "I was hoping you'd never need to see this." I opened it. The first page was a birth certificate. My eyes moved down the page. My mother's name was there. My father's name was there. But beside the word, father, there was a handwritten correction. Someone had crossed out my father's name and written another man's name underneath. I couldn't breathe. I looked up at the attorney. "What is this?" He spoke softly. "Your father discovered the truth before he died." "What truth?" He leaned forward. "Your mother wasn't the person who owned the house." I stared at him. "She inherited it from someone else." "Who?" He slid the photograph toward me. "The woman standing beside your father." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Who was she?" The attorney finally answered. "Your biological grandmother." I felt like the room disappeared around me. My grandmother had died when I was a baby. At least, that's what my mother had always told me. But according to the documents, she had been alive for years after my birth, and she had left the house to me. Not my mother, not my brother. Me. The attorney explained that my father had spent his final months collecting proof, because he suspected my mother had hidden the inheritance from me. The trust wasn't simply about the house. It was about protecting my inheritance from my family. And my father had left instructions that the evidence should be given to me if the property was ever transferred without my consent. That was why the stranger had come to my door. That was why Dad had waited. He knew they would eventually make a mistake. And they had. I went home that evening with tears streaming down my face. For years, I had thought my father had abandoned me emotionally during his final months. I remembered being angry with him. I remembered thinking he chose my brother over me. Now I realized he had been fighting for me in silence while he was dying. I sat on the floor and cried harder than I had since his funeral. Not because I had lost my home, because I finally understood how much my father had tried to protect me. The next day, I confronted my parents. They were sitting together when I walked into their house. My mother looked nervous. My father wasn't there. I placed the documents on the table. My mother stared at them. "You weren't supposed to find those." I looked at her. "No. I wasn't supposed to find out anything." My brother walked in from the kitchen. He saw the papers. His face went pale. I asked him one question. "How much did you owe?" He said nothing. My mother started crying. And for once, I didn't comfort her. She admitted everything. The house had been used to cover my brother's debts. My father had discovered it and threatened to expose them. After he died, they rushed the transfer before I could turn 31 and challenge it. They thought I would accept the story. That Dad had left me nothing. And they were wrong. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten them. I simply told them, "You didn't just steal a house from me. You stole years of trust." Then I walked away. The legal battle lasted months. Eventually, the transfer was overturned, and the property was placed back under the trust my father created. But I didn't move back in. I sold the house myself, not because I hated it, because I finally understood that home isn't always a place. Sometimes home is the person who believes you deserve better. Sometimes it's the courage to walk away from people who keep hurting you, and sometimes justice isn't about making someone suffer. It's about refusing to let their betrayal decide who you become. My parents lost their control over me that year. My brother had to face the consequences of his choices. And I finally stopped begging my family to love me the way I deserved. I kept one thing from that old house: the photograph of my father. I placed it beside my bed. Whenever I look at it, I remember the man who couldn't tell me the truth while he was alive, but still found a way to protect me after he was gone. If the people, faces, and photographs shown with this story appear in a video, please remember they are only visual recreations created to help imagine the events and are not necessarily the actual people involved. I used to believe losing my childhood home was the greatest betrayal my family could give me. Now I know it was the moment I finally found myself. Blood can make you family, but it cannot give anyone the right to destroy your peace. So if someone in your life has made you feel small, unwanted, or easy to replace, remember this: you don't have to beg for a place at a table where they keep moving your chair. Know your worth, protect your peace, and when the truth finally comes, don't be afraid to walk toward it. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself is not selfish. And subscribe to Calm Revenge Stories for more stories about betrayal, truth, justice, and finding strength when the people you trusted most let you down. The next morning, I drove to the law firm listed on the document. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face when she laughed at me. I kept asking myself the same question: why would my father leave something for me and hide it until after his death? When I walked into the office, an elderly man behind the desk looked at the papers in my hand. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get these?" "My father left them for me." He slowly stood up. "What was your father's name?" I told him. For a few seconds, he just stared at me, then he closed the office door. "Your father came here before he died," he said. My heart started pounding. "When?" "3 weeks before his death." I sat down. What did he want? The attorney opened an old file and placed it in front of me. He was worried about the house. I almost laughed from disbelief. "Everyone keeps telling me it's just a house." He looked at me carefully. "Your father never thought that." Then he pulled out several documents: bank statements, property records, a trust agreement, and photographs. My hands started shaking. "What am I looking at?" He pointed to the first page. "This house was placed in a trust when you were born." I stared at him. "For me?" He nodded. "Your father wanted you to have it when you became an adult." My eyes filled with tears. "But my mother said it was theirs. She wasn't telling you the truth." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at the papers again. My entire childhood suddenly felt different. Every Christmas, every birthday, every time my parents told me I was lucky to have them. I had always believed they were protecting me. Now I wondered if they had been protecting something from me. The attorney opened another folder. "There's more." Inside were copies of payments made against the house. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands. I recognized my brother's name. My stomach dropped. "What does my brother have to do with this?" The attorney took a slow breath. "Your father discovered that someone had been using the property to cover your brother's debts." I couldn't speak. Suddenly, memories came rushing back. My brother's expensive car, his failed business, the vacations my parents paid for. And every time I asked questions, my mother said the same thing: "Family helps best." I had believed her. I had been the one helping without even knowing it. The attorney handed me one final document. "This is what your father wanted you to see." I unfolded it. At the bottom was his signature, and beneath it, a handwritten message: "If they ever sell this house without telling my daughter, give her everything." I pressed my hand over my mouth. My father had known. He had known they might do this. And somehow, even while he was dying, he had still been trying to protect me. Then my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it. But I answered. Her voice was strangely calm. "Where are you?" I didn't tell her. She paused. Then she whispered, "You need to stop looking into the house." I stared at the documents. "Why?" Silence. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Because your father didn't tell you the whole truth. The call ended. I sat frozen in that office. For the first time, I wasn't wondering why my parents sold my home. I was wondering what they were so terrified I'd discover. I drove home from the law office, with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers hurt. My mother's last words kept replaying in my head. Your father didn't tell you the whole truth. I had spent my entire life believing my father was the one person in my family who understood me. He wasn't perfect. He could be distant sometimes. He worked too much. He wasn't the kind of father who hugged me every morning, or told me he was proud of me every week. But he showed up. When I was 9, and terrified of my first school performance, he sat in the front row even though he had been working a 12-hour shift. When I was 16 and came home crying, after my first boyfriend broke up with me, Dad didn't tell me to get over it. He made hot chocolate, sat beside me on the porch and said, "Some people leave because they were never meant to stay. Don't confuse their leaving with your worth." I never forgot that. So when he died, I didn't just lose my father, I lost the person I thought knew the real me. And now I was being told he had kept something enormous from me. I pulled into my apartment parking lot and sat inside my car for almost 20 minutes. I couldn't make myself get out. I looked at the wooden box sitting on the passenger seat. The same box that had appeared at my door the night I learned my parents had sold the house. I picked it up. For a moment, I considered throwing it into the back of my closet and forgetting everything. Maybe ignorance would be easier. Maybe I should let my parents keep the money. Maybe I should accept that the house wasn't legally mine and move on. But then I remembered my mother's laugh. Don't start acting entitled. Something inside me hardened. I got out of the car. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and placed the box on the kitchen table. I made coffee, then I didn't drink it. I opened the box again. There was the letter from Dad, the photograph, the documents, and one sealed envelope I hadn't opened yet. I had been too afraid before. Now I was angry enough not to care. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My father's handwriting covered both sides. My daughter, if you're reading this, then the house is no longer safe. I stopped breathing for a second. I kept reading. I know you will probably be angry with me. You have every right to be. I wanted to tell you everything myself, but I was running out of time. I put the paper down, my eyes filled with tears. Running out of time. Those words were different now. Before his death, I had thought Dad was simply sick. I knew he had been tired. I knew he had lost weight. I knew he had started going to doctor's appointments without telling us much. But whenever I asked if he was okay, he said, "I'm fine." I had believed him. I hated myself for that. I picked up the letter again. Your mother will tell you I was confused. She may tell you I was sick. She may even tell you that I imagined things near the end. I swallowed hard. Don't believe her. My heart began pounding. There are things about our family that were hidden from you long before you were old enough to understand them. I sat down. I read the sentence 3 times. Yes, long before you were old enough. What did that mean? I continued. The house belonged to your grandmother before it belonged to us. She left it under conditions your mother never accepted. I looked at the photograph. The woman beside Dad. My grandmother. I had only a handful of memories of her, mostly fragments. Her perfume, her soft gray sweater, a silver bracelet she used to wear, and a strange memory of her telling me, "Never let anyone convince you that being kind means being weak." My mother always said Grandma was difficult. She said she was cold. She said she had problems with money. She said she didn't want anything to do with our family. But Dad's letter was telling me something completely different. Grandmother had left the house to me. Why? I kept reading. Your mother wanted the property transferred to your brother years ago. I refused. The trust prevented her from doing that. My brother, of course. Everything always came back to him. He was the child everyone protected. The child whose mistakes became someone else's responsibility. The child who could lose a job, crash a car, borrow thousands of dollars, and still have my parents telling everyone he was just going through a difficult time. Meanwhile, I had paid my own college tuition. I worked 2 jobs. I never asked my parents for money. When I needed help, my mother would say, "You're strong. You'll figure it out." I had always thought that was a compliment. Now it sounded like an excuse. I read the next paragraph. "I need you to understand something. Your brother is not the reason this happened. He was only the excuse they used." I froze then. What was the reason? I kept reading. "The truth is more complicated than money." My hands began trembling. "If you find the original trust, you will see that your grandmother placed the house in your name because she believed your mother would never protect you." I covered my mouth. That sentence hurt. My own grandmother had apparently known something about my mother that I didn't. I read on. "She asked me to promise that you would never be told until you were old enough to make your own decisions." I kept that promise. Then came the line that made me stop completely. "But there is one thing I did not know until recently. Your birth was not what you were told it was." I stared at the paper. The room felt suddenly too quiet. I read it again. "Your birth was not what you were told it was." I couldn't move. My mind immediately rejected it. No, this was impossible. I had a birth certificate. I knew where I was born. I knew my mother had been in the hospital. I knew my father had been there. What could possibly be different? I turned the page. The final paragraph was short. "If they tell you that I am your biological father, ask for the original hospital records." I stopped. My father had just planted a question in my mind that I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I pushed the letter away. "No," I said it out loud. "No, Dad." I began crying. "You don't get to do this to me." For the first time since his death, I was angry with him. Not because he had left me. Because he had left me with questions. Questions I couldn't ask him anymore. I spent the next 2 hours walking around my apartment, touching random things just to remind myself I was still in the present. I looked at my family photographs. There I was at 5 years old, sitting on Dad's shoulders. At 8, holding my mother's hand. At 12, standing between my parents. At 20, graduating from college. At 25, my wedding. At 30, Dad's final birthday. I looked at his face. Was he looking at me differently in those pictures? Did he know? Had I been the only person in the room who didn't know? I couldn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I opened my laptop. I searched the name of the law firm. Then the attorney's name. Then property records. Then trust laws. I spent hours reading documents I barely understood. At sunrise, I found something. A public property record showed that the house had been transferred to my uncle just 8 days before I was told about the sale. 8 days. My parents had known for more than a week. They had continued talking to me. My mother had called me twice during that week. She had asked what I was doing for the weekend. She had told me my brother was finally getting his life together. She had even sent me a photograph of a pie she had baked, all while secretly selling my childhood home. I felt sick. Then I noticed something else. The recorded sale price was dramatically lower than the home's estimated market value. My uncle had supposedly purchased a house worth nearly $800,000 for less than half that amount. That wasn't a normal family sale. That was a transfer. I grabbed my phone. I called the attorney. He answered after several rings. "I was wondering when you'd call. Did you know about the transfer price?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me yesterday?" "Because I wanted you to hear the entire story before you made any decisions." "What decisions?" There was a pause. "Whether you want to fight." I looked at my father's letter. "I do." His voice softened. "Then you need to understand something. This won't be easy." "I don't care. You may lose relationships." I laughed bitterly. "They already sold my childhood home behind my back. I know. I don't have anything left to lose." The attorney was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You may be surprised." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. He told me to come back to the office that afternoon. When I arrived, he had another file waiting. He placed it in front of me. "This is from your grandmother's estate." I opened it. The first document was her will. I read slowly. She had left several small personal items to different family members. Jewelry, photographs, books. But the house had been placed into a trust for me. There was a reason written underneath: to protect my granddaughter from decisions made by those who have failed to protect her. My eyes filled with tears. I whispered. She knew. Yes. How? The attorney leaned back. Because your grandmother spent a lot of time observing your family. I looked at him. Did she hate my mother? No. His answer surprised me. She loved your mother. That's what made the situation harder. I frowned. What happened between them? He sighed. Your mother was not always like this. That sentence stayed with me. Everyone always tells us stories about people as if they were born good or bad. But people change. Fear changes people. Money changes people. Grief changes people. And sometimes, desperation changes people. The attorney explained that after my grandmother's husband died, she became concerned about my mother. My mother had accumulated serious financial problems. She was borrowing money. She was hiding bills. She was making promises she couldn't keep. My grandmother tried to help. But eventually, she discovered that some of the money was being used to cover my brother's growing expenses. I interrupted him. My brother wasn't even an adult then. Exactly. I stared at him. He continued. Your mother believed she was helping him. Your grandmother believed she was enabling him. That sounded painfully familiar. It was the same argument my parents had now. My mother always called it love. My grandmother had called it destruction. The attorney opened another file. This is a letter your grandmother wrote to your father. I read it. She had written about me, not my brother, me. She said she worried I was being taught to accept less because I was the responsible child. That phrase broke something in me. Because that was exactly what had happened. I had spent my entire childhood being praised for needing nothing. I was the easy child, the quiet child, the child who didn't complain, the child who understood when money was tight, the child who didn't ask why my brother got new shoes while I wore mine until they fell apart. I had thought being mature made me special. Maybe it had simply made me easy to overlook. I wiped my eyes. What happened to my grandmother? The attorney looked down. She died believing your mother would eventually change. And did she? He didn't answer. I already knew. My phone buzzed, a message from my brother. We need to talk. I stared at it. I hadn't spoken to him since the sale. I typed back. About what? His response came quickly. You know. I didn't answer. Another message appeared. Mom says you have Dad's papers. My heart sank. So they knew. I typed. Why are you afraid of the papers? No response. 5 minutes passed, then 10 finally. Because Dad promised he'd never use them against us. I stared at that sentence. Against us, not against me. Against us. I called him. He didn't answer. I called again. Still nothing. Then he sent a message. Please don't go to the police. I felt a chill move through me. I wasn't planning to go to the police. Not yet. But now I knew there was more. I called the attorney again. My brother is scared. That doesn't surprise me. He told me not to go to the police. The attorney was quiet, then he said, you should come back. I returned to the office that evening. He had one more file. This time, he didn't immediately hand it to me. He looked at me for a long moment. Your father wanted me to give you this only if you were prepared to hear everything. I swallowed. I am. I need you to be certain. I am. He opened the file. Inside was a photograph of my parents. They were younger, much younger. And standing beside them was a man I had never seen. I looked at the attorney. Who is that? He didn't answer. Instead, he placed another document beside the photograph, a medical record. I looked at the name. It was my mother's. The date was the year before I was born. I started reading. Then I stopped. The record mentioned a pregnancy, but the dates didn't match the story I'd been told. I looked up. What am I looking at? The attorney finally spoke. Your mother was pregnant before she met your father. My heart started pounding. What? She lost that baby. I stared at him. Then he said the next sentence. Months later, she became pregnant again. I looked at the photograph, the unknown man. My mother's old medical records. My father's letter. Everything was starting to connect, but not cleanly. Not yet. I asked. Who was the man? The attorney's face became serious. His name was Daniel. I repeated it. Daniel who? He gave me the name. I knew it immediately. I had heard it once before. From my mother, years ago. It was during a family argument. She had been furious with Dad and had shouted something about Daniel ruining everything. When I asked her who Daniel was, she told me he was an old friend. Then she never mentioned him again. I felt cold. Was he my biological father? The attorney didn't answer directly. Your father believed he might be. I sat back. No, I know this is difficult. No, I shook my head. My father was my father. I understand. He raised me. I know. He loved me. Yes. Then why does this matter? The attorney looked at me. Because the property trust was created under conditions tied to your biological identity. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means your grandmother had a reason for putting the property in your name. I felt like I was falling through the chair. What reason? He reached into the file. He pulled out a letter. This is from your grandmother to your father. I opened it. The handwriting was delicate. My dear son, if the child is Daniel's, she will need protection from what happens next. I stopped reading. My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes and forced myself to continue. Your mother will never accept the truth. She will blame the child for everything that happened between them. Please don't let that happen. I couldn't breathe. The child, me. My grandmother had written about me before I was even born. And she had known my mother might blame me. I read the final lines. If she grows up believing she is unwanted, she may spend her entire life trying to earn love she should have received freely. Protect her from that. I lowered the letter. I couldn't stop crying. For years, I had wondered why my mother was always harder on me than my brother. Why she praised him for doing the bare minimum, but expected perfection from me. Why she seemed uncomfortable whenever I needed comfort. Why she could look at my brother with softness and look at me like I was another responsibility. Maybe the answer wasn't that I was difficult. Titch. Maybe I reminded her of something she wanted to forget. I left the law office after dark. The city lights blurred through my tears as I drove. When I got home, I found another message from my brother. I need to see you alone. I almost deleted it. Then another message appeared. Please. Before Mom finds out. I agreed. We met at a quiet coffee shop the next morning. My brother looked terrible. He had dark circles beneath his eyes. He kept looking toward the door. When he sat across from me, he didn't say hello. He just stared at me. You have Dad's papers. Yes. Did you read everything? Not everything. He rubbed his hands together. There's something you need to know. I waited. He looked down. I didn't know about the house. I laughed. Then why did you tell me not to call the police? Because I knew they were hiding something. Who? He hesitated. Mom. I felt my stomach tighten. What did she tell you? He looked at me. She said the house had to be sold because Dad left debts. That isn't true. I know that now. Then why did you go along with it? His eyes filled with tears. I was scared. I stared at him. He continued. Mom told me if the house wasn't sold, I'd lose everything. What everything? My business. I shook my head. What business? He looked embarrassed. The company. You still have that? No. I frowned. What happened? It collapsed. He looked down. I owed people money. I already knew where this was going. My parents had used the house to rescue him. Again, he admitted that Mom had promised to clear his debts using money from the property, but there was something else. She told me Dad had agreed before he died. My chest tightened. Did you believe her? At first. Then what changed? He looked at me. 3 weeks ago I found one of Dad's old notebooks. My heart stopped. What notebook? He reached into his jacket. He placed a small black notebook on the table. I think you should have it. I didn't touch it. What's inside? Everything. I stared at the notebook. My brother pushed it toward me. Dad wrote down dates, names, payments, conversations. I picked it up. Why didn't you give this to me before? He looked ashamed. Because I was afraid. Of Mom? Yes, and now? He swallowed. Now I'm more afraid of what happens if you never find out. I opened the notebook. The first page had my father's handwriting. The second page had dates. The third had names. My mother's, my uncle's, my brother's, And then one name that made my heart stop, Daniel. I looked up. My brother whispered, Dad spent the last year trying to find him. Why? I don't know. You must know something. He shook his head. All I know is that Dad believed Daniel was still alive. I stared at the notebook. Where? My brother looked away. He found him. I felt my entire body go cold. Where? My brother hesitated, then he said, about 6 months before Dad died. I closed the notebook. Why didn't Dad tell me? I think he was trying to protect you. From what? My brother looked directly into my eyes. From Mom. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my brother reached across the table and took my hand. It was the first time he had done that in years. I know I've been selfish, he said. I pulled my hand back. You have. I know. You let Mom treat me differently. I know. You took things that weren't yours. I know. You watched them sell the house. I know. My voice cracked. You didn't even warn me. He started crying. I was ashamed. I looked away. Part of me wanted to forgive him. Another part wanted to remind myself that forgiveness didn't erase consequences. I stood. I need to go. Where? To find Daniel. My brother's face changed. You can't. Why? He looked terrified. Because Mom knows where he is too. I froze. Then I guess we're finally going to find out what she's been hiding. I left the coffee shop with the notebook pressed against my chest. For the first time since the house was sold, I didn't feel helpless. I felt something stronger. I felt ready. That afternoon, I went back through the notebook. There were dozens of pages, dates, pawn numbers, asheras, notes about bank transfers. My father had been documenting everything. Then, I found a page with these sentences written in bold ink. If anything happens to me, find Daniel before she does. Underneath was an address. I stared at it. It was less than 2 hours away. My hands began to shake. I grabbed my keys. Before leaving, I looked at my father's photograph. I don't know what I'm going to find, I whispered. But I'm going to find it. I drove for nearly 2 hours. The address led me to a small house at the end of a quiet road. There was an old pickup truck outside. I sat in my car for several minutes. I was terrified. What if this man told me I wasn't his daughter? What if he knew my mother? What if he had abandoned me? What if the entire story about my childhood was built on a lie? I almost drove away. Then I remembered Dad's words. Don't let them decide your worth. I stepped out. I walked to the front door. My hand hovered over the bell. Then I pressed it. Nothing happened. I knocked. Still nothing. I knocked again. Finally, I heard footsteps. The door opened slightly. An older man stood behind it. His hair was gray. His face looked tired. He stared at me. I stared back. Neither of us spoke. Then his eyes moved to the photograph I was holding. My father's photograph. His face suddenly changed. He opened the door wider. You're his daughter. I swallowed. Yes. He looked at me for a long moment, then he whispered, he finally sent you. My heart stopped. What do you mean? Daniel looked over his shoulder. Then he stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind him. Your father came here 6 months before he died. I know. Daniel's face tightened. He told me what happened. What happened? He looked at me with tears in his eyes. Everything your mother never wanted you to know. I felt my knees weaken. What did she do? Daniel looked toward the road. Then he said something I wasn't prepared to hear. She didn't just hide the truth about your father. He looked directly at me. She tried to make sure you would never discover it. I stood completely still. Daniel took a slow breath. And your childhood homes was only the beginning. Daniel's words followed me into the house like a warning. She tried to make sure you would never discover it. I stood there, staring at him. For years, I had blamed myself for the distance between my mother and me. I had wondered what was wrong with me. Why was I never enough? Why did she seem to love my brother so easily, while every little thing I did somehow disappointed her? And now this man was telling me the problem had never been me. What did she do? I asked again. Daniel looked toward the window before answering. She told your father that I wanted nothing to do with you. My chest tightened. What? She said I had disappeared. That I knew about the pregnancy and walked away. That isn't true. No. He shook his head. I didn't even know you existed until years later. I stared at him. Then how did you find out?
Your father told me?
I sat down slowly. Daniel explained that he and my mother had known each other before she married my father. Their relationship had ended badly, but he had never known she was pregnant. When my mother discovered she was expecting, she had chosen to marry my father. Not because she loved him, because she needed stability. At least, that was what Daniel believed. But my father had loved me from the moment he knew I existed. He had raised me as his daughter without hesitation. Daniel had tears in his eyes when he said that. Your father was a better man than I was, he whispered. He could have hated me. Instead, he spent years protecting you from a truth he thought would hurt you. I looked down. Then why did he finally tell you? It's because he was dying. That sentence broke me. Daniel told me my father had visited him months before his death. He had brought photographs, medical records, and copies of the trust. He had wanted Daniel to know that I existed. But more importantly, he wanted someone outside the family to know what was happening. My father suspected my mother was preparing to sell the house and use the money to settle my brother's debts. Daniel had agreed to help, but before they could finish everything, my father died. Then Daniel showed me something. A recording, my father's voice. I heard it through a small phone speaker, and for a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. My daughter, he said, if you are hearing this, then I wasn't able to tell you myself. I covered my mouth. His voice sounded weaker than I remembered. But it was still him. I need you to know something. None of this changes who I am to you. I am your father because I chose to be. I loved you every day of your life. I started crying. I know there are things you will learn that may make you question everything. Don't. The truth about your birth does not change the truth about your childhood. I closed my eyes. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Because the entire time, I had been terrified that discovering the truth about my biological father would somehow erase the man who raised me. It didn't. Dad had made that clear. His voice continued. Your mother may try to convince you that you owe her because she gave birth to you. You don't. Love is not a debt. I broke down. Those words felt like they had been written for the woman I had become. For years, my mother had used sacrifice as a weapon. I raised you. I fed you. I gave you a home. I was there for you. And every time I disagreed with her, I felt guilty. Dad's recording continued. You are allowed to walk away from anyone who makes you feel guilty for protecting yourself. The recording ended. I sat in silence. Daniel didn't interrupt me. After a while, I asked him the question that had been haunting me. Why did my mother hate me? Daniel shook his head. I don't think she hated you. I looked at him. She blamed you. For what? For the life she thought she lost. My heart sank. Daniel explained that my mother had spent years resenting the choices she made. She blamed my father. She blamed Daniel. She blamed my grandmother. And somewhere along the way, she began blaming me, not because I had done anything wrong, because I reminded her of every decision she regretted. I thought about all those years. Every time I walked into a room and my mother became quiet. Every time she compared me to my brother. Every time she told me I was too sensitive. I finally understood. She had been fighting a war inside herself. And I had been standing in the middle of it. But understanding her didn't excuse what she had done. It didn't make the betrayal disappear. I asked Daniel one final question. Does my mother know you're here? He looked at me. She does now. My stomach dropped. What? He pointed toward the window. A black SUV was parked across the street. My mother's car. I felt the blood drain from my face. She followed you. Daniel said. I stood immediately. My phone started ringing. Mom. I didn't answer. It stopped. Then it rang again. I finally picked up. Her voice was cold. You had no right to go looking for him. I looked at Daniel. I had every right. You don't understand what you're doing. No, I understand exactly what I'm doing. She became quiet, then she said, come home. I almost laughed. Home? Yes, you sold it. You know what I mean. No, Mom, I don't. I felt tears running down my cheeks, but my voice stayed steady. You sold the house Dad wanted me to have. You used it to rescue my brother. You lied about the trust. You lied about my birth. You lied about Daniel. She didn't answer. And you spent my entire life making me feel like I was the problem. Her voice cracked. You don't know what I went through. You're right. I took a breath. But neither did I. She started crying. For the first time, I heard my mother's pain without feeling responsible for fixing it. That was a new feeling. She begged me to come home. I said no. She threatened to tell people I was destroying the family. I told her the family had been destroyed by secrets long before I discovered them. Then she said the words I had heard my entire life. You're my daughter. I closed my eyes. I know. And you owe me. I opened my eyes again. No. There was silence, then I said, I don't owe anyone my silence. I ended the call. Daniel looked at me. You're stronger than your father thought you would need to be. I smiled through my tears. I wish I didn't have to be. He nodded. So do I. The legal battle began soon after. My attorney filed everything. The trust, the original property records, the fraudulent transfer, the bank statements, the documents proving my father's intentions. Daniel provided his testimony. My brother eventually gave a statement too. That was the hardest part for him. He admitted that he had known the house was being transferred. He admitted that Mom had pressured him. And he admitted that Dad had warned him before he died. You're going to lose your sister if you keep letting your mother make your decisions. Dad had told him. My brother cried when he told me that. He said he wished he had listened. I wanted to forgive him immediately. But I couldn't, not yet. Some wounds need time. The case lasted months. My mother fought every step. She claimed Dad had been mentally confused before his death. She claimed the trust was outdated. She claimed I had misunderstood the property arrangements. But then the original records appeared. The attorney had preserved everything. My father's handwriting. My grandmother's will. The trust. The bank transfers. The messages between my mother and my uncle. And finally, the recording. The truth became impossible to bury. The property transfer was overturned. The house was legally returned to the trust. My mother and uncle had to face the financial consequences. My brother lost his business. But for the first time, he took responsibility for it. He didn't ask me for money. He didn't ask me to save him. He simply said, I'll fix what I can. That meant more to me than any apology. As for me, I went back to Maple Street one last time. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch where Dad had taught me to ride a bike. The window where Mom used to stand waiting for me after school. The tree I had climbed when I was 12. Everything was still there, but I wasn't the same woman who had grown up inside those walls. I walked into my old bedroom. There were still faint pencil marks on the closet door. I touched them. I remembered the little girl I had been. She had spent so much of her life trying to be good enough, trying not to cause trouble, trying not to ask for too much, trying to make everyone happy. I wished I could go back and tell her something. You were never too much. You were simply asking the wrong people to give you what they weren't capable of giving. I cried then. Not because I wanted the house, because I was finally letting go of the little girl who thought love had to be earned. I sold the house a few months later. My attorney asked if I was sure. I kept only a few things. Dad's photograph, grandmother's silver bracelet, the wooden box, and the little black notebook my brother had given me. I didn't keep the house. I kept the truth. And that was worth more. My mother and I haven't spoken since the case ended. For a long time, I thought that meant I had failed. I thought a good daughter was supposed to forgive everything. Then I understood something. Forgiveness doesn't require access. You can forgive someone and still keep the door closed. You can understand someone's pain without allowing them to become the source of yours. And you can love someone from a distance when being close to them destroys your peace. I eventually met Daniel again. He didn't try to become my father. He never asked for that. He simply became someone who knew where I came from. And somehow, that was enough. My brother and I slowly rebuilt our relationship too, not because we pretended nothing happened, because we finally started telling each other the truth. One evening, he asked me if I regretted everything. The lawsuit. The confrontation. Shant. Finding Daniel. Learning the truth. I thought about it. Then I shook my head. No, he looked surprised. I lost a family, I told him. But I found myself. He smiled sadly. I think Dad would be proud. I looked at the photograph beside me. I think so too. There are days when I still miss that house. Not because of its walls. Because of who I was when I lived there. I miss Dad sitting on the porch. I miss the smell of my mother's cooking before everything changed. I miss being a child before I understood that adults could lie. But I don't wish I could go back. Because if I went back, I might never become the woman I am today. The woman who finally learned to ask questions. The woman who stopped confusing guilt with love. The woman who realized that sharing DNA doesn't give someone permission to break your heart. And the woman who finally understood what Dad meant. All those years ago, some people leave because they were never meant to stay. And their leaving doesn't decide your worth. My parents thought selling my childhood home would leave me with nothing. They were wrong. They took a building. They took memories. They took years of trust, but they accidentally gave me something I could never have bought. The courage to stop begging for love. The courage to stand in the truth. And the courage to choose myself. The photographs, faces, and people shown alongside this story are only visual recreations created for storytelling and imagination. They should not be taken as actual images of the people involved. If there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, it's this. Family is supposed to be where you feel safe. But when family becomes the place where you are constantly wounded, protecting yourself is not betrayal. It's survival. I spent years thinking I had to earn my family's love. Now I know I was born deserving of it. And if someone makes you feel like you have to destroy yourself just to keep them happy, remember this. You can love people without losing yourself. You can forgive without forgetting. And you can walk away without being cruel. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't making someone regret what they did. Sometimes it's building a peaceful life they no longer have the power to disturb. So, tell me in the comments. If you discovered that your family had hidden something this big from you, would you confront them or walk away? Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that choosing yourself is not selfish. And subscribe to Calm Revenge Stories for more stories about betrayal, truth, justice, and the strength it takes to finally say, enough.